For stopping by. My name is Mark Marchand. I'm here on behalf of the Clifton Park Tree Committee, which is part of the Green Committee under the auspices of the Town Board of Clifton Park. And we focus mostly on environment and trees. So I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Addison Kubik. He's the Invasive Species Education Volunteer and Outreach Coordinator at Capital Region PRISM. If you're like me, I didn't know when somebody first said to me what PRISM is, and it's a partnership under the Cornell Cooperative Extension Partnership for the Regional Management of Invasive Species. And that's where Addison spends most of his time. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in conservation biology from the State University of New York's College of Environmental Science and Forestry. He worked as a forest health technician at the Department of Environmental Conservation, or ENCON, and prior to his current position was a native plant educator at Capital Botany. And for those of you who follow these topics locally, he was here last fall and gave a great talk about invasive plant species, which we all went home and started looking for invasive plants that didn't belong there. So, without further ado, I will mention that Mark is recording this, and we do post these on YouTube. So if you missed something in Addison's presentation, you can go back and catch it. And without further ado, Addison, you have the helm.
Thank you very much, Mark. As Mark mentioned, my name is Addison Kubik, and first of all, thank you all for choosing to spend your Monday afternoon with me. It is not Wednesday. I very much appreciate it. I know that free time is hard to come by, and the fact that you're all choosing to spend some of it trying to learn some, I love that. And without any further ado, as Mark mentioned with that beautiful introduction, I work for the Capital Region PRISM, which was beautifully laid out beforehand. It's a partnership for regional invasive species management. You can see there up on the map, there are 8 such prisms throughout New York State, each of which funded by the DEC through the Environmental Protection Fund, and each one hosted by different agencies. Some are hosted by the Nature Conservancy, Western New York is hosted by the University of Buffalo, and then us at the Capital Region, we are hosted within the Cornell Cooperative Extension, and my office is up in Boston Spa at the CCC office up there. And now that we've got some of that fun, bubbly stuff out of the way, let's start talking about something depressing. How do you guys feel about that? So, today I'm going to be talking to you guys about a variety of different forest pests that are either here currently impacting our lives in our forests or are on their way and will be impacting us. Here's a quick glance of some of the ones I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to hit all of these because obviously we have only so much time, but I'm going to hit up on what I consider to be the most important ones, and not only that, the ones that are still, there's something to be done, and it's not just learning to live with. And I'm going to start off with what I imagine many of you would also consider to be the celebrity up here on this page, the one everybody wants to know about first, at least anytime I'm going out anywhere. And that is our good pal here, Mr. Spongy Moth, Lymantria dispar, formerly known as the gypsy moth, now known as the spongy moth. This is a very, very popular topic of conversation in this area. As many of you are aware, last year was a particularly brutal year for the spongy moth. You can see up there. Wait for it. Boom. This is just a nice little photo of all of that mass defoliation caused by this handsome little devil right here. Now, a little background on the spongy moth. The spongy moth, originally native to Europe, actually brought here in 1869 to the town of Medford, Massachusetts. This one is interesting. With a lot of invasive species, we have to try to guess how they may have gotten here, but with the spongy moth, we know exactly how they got here. So the year is 1868. A couple of industrious young fellows are deciding that the Civil War has ravaged a lot of the country. The silk moths are starting to decline. Let's revolutionize the silk industry. Let's hybridize our silk moths with these moths from Europe. We're going to bring them over here, and wouldn't you know it, that crossbreeding was a colossal failure. It did not yield any positive results. But what it did manage to do was introduce this little guy into our native forest, where it now feeds on, you can see right up there, over 300 species of trees. They tend to prefer oak more than anything else, so oak is always the first one they're going to go after. But if his goal was to make himself famous so that nobody would ever forget who he was, he succeeded. In case you want to write it down in your journals of rage, I'm going to try to pronounce this name, but it's very French, and I'm going to do a very bad job. Etienne L. Trouvelet is a bad pronunciation of the poor gentleman who I am slandering in front of you all right now for introducing this little creature into our lives. Here is another picture of this insane defoliation. These guys, they come out of their caterpillars. They love to eat the leaves. They start coming out right around late spring, early summer. So right around now is when they're starting to really hatch. And they go up into the canopy and they just eat like gangbusters. Nothing stops them whatsoever. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those aspects as I move forward. But real quick, how do you know if you've got spongy moth? How do you know what signs to look for spongy moth? Well, obviously, the first thing to look for, if you have heavy defoliation in a tree at a time you wouldn't normally expect it, like, I don't know, June, for example, that's going to be a good sign that something might be going wrong. Over here, you can see these are their egg masses. These are where they have their new common name of spongy moth. And the reason I like this new name is because I always like it when a name describes a characteristic of something, so you can actually make a connection to a name and a place. And their egg sacs, which are right here, and that's another one right there, they look and they feel like they're little spongy things. They actually feel like sponges if you press your fingers up against them. It's kind of gross, but it is what it is. I'll talk a little bit more about the actual specificities of what the adults and the caterpillars look like when I actually have pictures up on the slide. But suffice to say, these guys are a mammoth problem. Each one of these egg sacs, they're very small, typically about the size of a thumb, and each one of those egg sacs, each individual can have anywhere from 500 to 1,000 eggs in it. And when you just think about the sheer reproductive capacity that a lot of these things have, it doesn't surprise you when they get really, really out of control like this. And over here, this is just a quick picture of some of the insides. I'm going to go off on a quick tangent. The interesting thing, and probably the most important thing to know about the spongy moth and the way that it works, is that it tends to operate on a relatively repeatable 10 to 15 year boom-bust population cycle. So you'll have about a decade-long span where they're barely noticeable at all in the wild, and then as such, the damage they cause is also barely noticeable. And I'll give you guys a guess as to which one of those stages we have been in for this year and last year. It was the boom cycle. That's where we are right now. We have a lot of these, and what really causes that is sort of a whole slew of interactions in predator-prey dynamics plus mast species. So generally, every once in a while, all the different mast-producing trees in the forest will line up and not produce mast in the same year. That'll bring down all those small mammal populations, and those mammal populations will be low enough for a long enough time that the spongy moth populations can start to spin out of control. And if you think about it, it doesn't take that long of having no predation pressure for something that's able to reproduce with this many offspring to really start to go out of control. And you can see up in that picture on the left, this is what they're looking like right at hatch. They've got 5 instars, and instar is just like another word for the early stages of an insect. They've got 5 instars, they look like this, and then they slowly get bigger, and as they get bigger, you can see their really obvious identification feature, which is for the caterpillars. They've got these really conspicuous 6 pairs of raised red dots, followed by 5 pairs of raised blue dots. No other caterpillar you're going to look at is going to look like that. And also, just for noting of everybody here, if you see them in the wild, some people, not everybody, do get reactions from the hairs on the caterpillar. So just know that if you're going to go out and touching them and squashing them and whatnot. Over here, you can see this is obviously their later stage instar. This is what their pupae look like. This is when they're all cocooned up. And then this guy right here, This is the male moth, and this one is the female moth. There's a couple of differences that really distinguish the two, and there's a little bit of a better picture I have on the next slide to really show the color differences. But indication, first thing to know, the female moth of this species does not fly, which is useful in that it's a lot harder for them to move around when the females don't fly. So the females, they leave their cocoons and they just hang on to one spot and they blast out their pheromones for everybody to smell. And then these ones, this is the male species, and you can tell them, the male actually, their antennae are much more feathered versus the much more simple antennae of the females, because the male need to have those antennae to detect the pheromones of where the females are. They detect the pheromones, they go over, they do their thing, and then next thing you know, you've got another bunch of egg masses popping up all over the place. And this shows a little bit of the differences. The males tend to be more of a mottled color. These pictures sort of have different lighting, so it's hard to tell the nuances of the color difference, but down here, this does a much better job of showing both of them right next to each other. So the females, as you notice, are slightly larger than the males, as is often the case with a lot of things, since reproduction requires more energy and more things for the body. You can see them laying the eggs right there on the bottom. And while the males are more mottled throughout their wings, the females have this really distinct dark band right across the middle that makes them really easy to identify. And an interesting thing about the spongy moth, a lot of times when I'm telling people about how to manage their trees, most people will manage the trees they have by they'll band the trees either with burlap or some sort of sticky banding, depending on what stages the caterpillars are. And a lot of people will come up to me and they'll be like, I get it, but I put the banding on my tree and then I look up into the canopy and I just see a bunch of egg masses up there. So what's the point of putting the banding down here if the eggs are all throughout the canopy? And one of the really interesting, cool features of the spongy moth is that they're super duper photopositive. And that basically just means they react to the sun being up in the sky. So when the sun comes up, they all join their great migration. They go up the bole of the tree and they feast their little brains out to their heart's content for the whole day. The sun goes down, and then they rappel down on their silk like little SWAT teams, and they hide amongst the forest floor or the leaf litter. And then the next day the sun comes back up, and they do that all over again. So the banding is actually able to capture a lot more than people would initially think once you realize that they go through this great migration up and down the trees every day. And another thing that a lot of people say, because oftentimes, or seldom is it that someone is only trying to protect just one tree. Usually it's a host of trees. Sometimes they're trying to protect acres of property. And this graph right here, if spongy moth is a thing that you deal with in your life and you're trying to do something about it, I highly recommend taking a picture of this graph. This shows which trees are the most likely to be fed on by the spongy moth. And if you know which ones they are going to go for, and more importantly, which ones they're not going to go for, you can more appropriately triage whatever resources you have to trying to actually prevent the spongy moth from damaging your trees. And it's important to know, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, they are always going to go after oak trees first. Oak trees are by far their favorite snack, and who doesn't love an oak tree? They very, very overwhelmingly prefer oaks. Seldom will they go onto conifers or your evergreen trees. And one thing to note, the mass defoliation caused by the caterpillars, typically trees can recover and rebound from that defoliation. They'll be completely defoliated by June, but usually by mid-July, they will leaf out again. But the leaves will be a little bit smaller, and it's important to note, while a tree can recover from a defoliation, it's really, really hard to do that 2, 3, 4 years in a row. Because you think about how high of an energy cost it is to regrow all of your leaves, and then pair that with all of the energy you weren't able to get when you didn't have any leaves during one of the main photosynthetic periods of the tree's life cycle. And what happens a lot of time is that defoliation weakens the tree, or not a lot of the time, but what can happen often is that defoliation, especially in subsequent years, can weaken the tree's natural defenses just enough that it can then open the door for secondary pathogens to then come in. to the tree's weakened immune system and can really deliver that quick 1-2 punch. It is interesting to note there are a handful right now of natural pathogens that exist in the wild that do functionally control to a certain degree the spongy moth. The main three are the pathogen, NPV, I'm not even going to bother trying to pronounce that. There's a soil bacterium, BTK, and then there's a fungus as well. And you can tell oftentimes what killed them based on their body positioning. This right here, this inverse A form is a very distinct signifier that they were killed by the virus. And then this fungus here, so they'll either die in this upside down V shape, or they will just sort of straighten out and desiccate, like you can kind of see in some of these things. And that is what the fungus does. And for lack of a better term, they just both kind of eat them from the inside out. It's unfortunate, but life is a brutal, the natural world is a brutal, terrible place, but I love it anyway. And then obviously, to a much smaller degree, there are mice and wasps and other small mammals and predators that feed on these things, but when they're in their bust cycle, or the boom part of their population cycle, none of these small mammals or insects feed only on the spongy moth, which means that they're not really able to put enough pressure on the spongy moth to really bring them down without everything sort of coming together. And these three things all activate to different levels depending on certain environmental factors. For example, the fungus is typically more active in wet years than it is in dry years, which is problematic considering how dry it was last year and how dry it's appearing this year. But broadly speaking, so far this year, year to date, last year versus this year, I'm seeing spongy moth much less active than I was at this time last year. I'm still seeing caterpillars, I'm still seeing egg masses, but last year was legitimately one of the worst years I've ever seen or heard about for spongy moth. It was bonkers bananas. It's so bad sometimes you can be walking through the forest and it sounds like it's raining, but that's just these little guys going to absolute town on the canopy above you. And it's definitely an interesting experience, but it's an unsettling experience as well. And I mentioned how your broadleaf trees can typically recover from a defoliation event. But in the rare instances where they do feed on conifers or evergreens, which generally they'll only do if they've already defoliated everything else available, those evergreen trees aren't adapted to be able to regrow their leaves. So if an evergreen tree gets defoliated to about 50%, that tree is going to die. There's nothing you can do about it at that point. It's just an unfortunate, very, very unfortunate consequence of life with the spongy moth. I'm going to skip this. That doesn't matter. All right. This one, you can take a sigh of relief. This one is not actively here. You're not going to see this one if you go outside right now. And if you do, please tell me immediately, because that's a very big deal. I need to tell people about it. So this is the spotted lanternfly, Lycorma delicatula. Those pictures on the right, you've got, this is their adult stage, and then these are their two nymphal stages. So their first 4 nymph stages look like this guy, little really, really tiny guys, all black with these white spots. And then their very last nymph stage is this Darth Maul, Star Wars looking character right here, that then eventually will molt into this. And then this jabroni, I don't know who this clown is. I'm just kidding. That's me with our... So the control method for these guys, the management method is straight up, this is a backpack vacuum where we just suck them right off the trees. And I haven't gotten to use it on the spongy moth yet. This day I was using it on a carpenter ant infestation in our equipment shed. But I would be lying to you if I didn't enjoy pretending I was a Ghostbuster with that thing. It's a childhood dream that I'm happy to finally live out in some way. Now, a little bit of background on the spotted lanternfly. So the spotted lanternfly, an insect native to Asia, originally brought over here, almost definitely through shipping of some kind, be it pallets or some kind of shipping method. That's how basically almost everything gets here, is through shipping. Originally found in Pennsylvania about 10 years ago, a little under 10 years ago, and a really interesting thing to note about its introduction. So, after its introduction, there have been very strict quarantines that have going around. And the Department of Ag and Markets, who is leading the fight on the prevention aspect of this, has been really, really gung-ho about these quarantine areas. And while it may seem pessimistic that, oh, this was found in 2014 and it continues to spread, a good counter to that is, so the spotted lanternfly, when it invaded the Korean peninsula, there was no management done whatsoever to try to control its spread, and it took over the entire peninsula in less than a year. So with that frame of reference, the fact that it's taken almost 10 years for it to move from Pennsylvania up into the downstate lower Hudson area, while not perfect, that's a pretty solid record of slowing the movement. And one of the biggest threats of the spotted lanternfly is its potential damages to agriculture and production. I'll talk a little bit more about this in some later slides, but the main three crops that the spotted lanternfly threatens are apples, huge crop for New York State. Apples are huge here. Grapes, which is big for wine production, another huge thing produced in New York State. And then, if you're anything like me and you like to drink beer every once in a while, they love to feed on hops as well. And those three things are absolutely killer, terrifying. I don't like the implications of what those could mean when they get up here. I'll talk a little bit more about their feeding habits in some later slides. But just another quick thing. Instars, then they molt into this as their adult stage. I will admit, they're a very charismatic insect, which is always easy when something is very flashy and shiny and sticks out to you like a sore thumb. They're about an inch wide or an inch long, and I once had them described to me as burlesque dancers, and somehow that it works perfectly because they've got these brick-like patterns on their outer wings and these really bright red underwings that they really only see when they're about to hop. They look slightly more nondescript otherwise, but interestingly enough, they don't really fly very much, but boy howdy do they hop. They hop like you would not believe. So I mentioned the damages that these can pose to a lot of agricultural industries, and I just want to draw your attention to this photo right here. And just the amount of insects that are on that tree. This is a very, very common occurrence in the places where the spotted lanternfly is very prevalent. They congregate via the thousands on the tree. And not only are they a threat to agriculture, they are a tremendous threat. Not necessarily a threat, but a very large human nuisance in the areas where they are. There's a video I'm going to show you in a few minutes that exemplifies some of that. But 30 million bushels of apple, and then the grapes are $52.8 million a year. And that number is from like 3 years ago, so that's way higher now with whatever the value of the dollar is. And in addition to, the worst thing about them is that they don't kill the plants that they feed on. They just basically render the products non-viable. They don't kill the plant, but they've got these long straw mouth parts. They stick it right in and they feed right on the sap. And that sap is so high in sugar, their waste is called honeydew. It's basically just like super sugary poop. And then they just blast that all over the leaves, all over the fruits. That honeydew then becomes a vector for sooty mold to grow. And then so basically a farm can put all years worth of work into doing everything right, only for the apples to be made non-viable because some stinky little insect didn't know to go to the bathroom, not where he eats. Words to live by.
Are they trainable?
I haven't tried to train them yet. And this is an example. This is a normal tree, and then this is all of that mold that I was telling you about. This is them congregated on a grapevine, and here is a bunch of non-viable grape that is covered in mold and lanternfly poop. Not good. And this is sort of just a broad description of all the things that the spotted lanternfly can really do to agriculture. But this next video, so in areas where the spotted lanternfly is very prevalent, people experience this thing called honeydew rain. And I'm just going to leave that floating out there for your brains to think about. And then we're going to hope this video works. And I don't get a weird advertisement. Or nothing will happen. Either one can work. I really want you to see this video though, so I'm going to find a way to make it happen. I'm giving myself 30 seconds. Let's take it. YouTube is spinning. I promise this is way easier when I was playing this at home. And just don't let any of your grandkids or any of your children ever tell you that technology difficulties don't happen when you're young, because clearly I am batting 1,000 right now. Well, I tried, needless to say. Honeydew Rain is about exactly what you would imagine it is. It is, it's these guys blasting. This is a great video. Unfortunately, I can't show it to you right now, but if you want, I can email it to you later. My email will be up here later. But basically, here, why don't I just act it out? Here we have a little lanternfly, and then our laser pointer is going to be our honeydew. Here's me standing right here, your normal person, just doing whatever, and then, ah! That's what honeydew is. And it's upsetting. And learn from me. I hope none of you ever have to experience that in person. And it's a real problem on things like that mold grows on the sides of their houses, on their decks, on their lawn furniture. So this is a really big one that I think we should all work together to try really hard to keep from getting here. Good news and bad news about that. I'll talk about that in a second. So this quickly is their life cycle. And this is really important when I talk about their main methods of moving around. So they have just started to hatch. This is when they're usually hatching. Throughout the summer months, they go through their full stage. This is their adult stage, generally the end of the summer. They start laying their eggs in the fall, and then their eggs overwinter, and then the whole process starts over again. And the important thing to note about these eggs, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in some future slides, is that the spotted lanternfly isn't great at spreading itself on its own. However, we are great at taking it with us when we move to places. So their egg masses, they're really nondescript. They look almost like mud splatter, which is really great when you're trying to survey for them along a trail covered in mud. It makes it really super duper easy. So they'll lay their eggs. This is what they look like uncovered. And then they'll put this waxy coating over the top of them. And the eggs are the real killer with a spotted lanternfly. They will lay their eggs on any hard surface whatsoever. Tree, this is a picture of them laying some eggs on a rusted old barrel. That's just a piece of wood. And the real kicker is the wheel wells of people's cars. The lanternfly will lay their eggs on the wheel wells of people's cars. You go down to Pennsylvania to visit your friend. You're not paying attention. Lanternfly comes up, lays some eggs on the inside of your car. You have no idea. Next thing you know, oh, well, next week I'm going to go meet my buddy Bob up at Dave's Pick Your Own Apple Farm. So then you go to the Pick Your Own Apple Farm, and you just hand-delivered a fresh patch of pests right to the apple farm. If I had done a pumpkin patch, that would have been very alliterative. I'll save that for next time. But this is the main killer that they really spread around on. And if you look at their spread, it's very obviously tied to major transportation corridors. There's a handful of spots where they are in New York State. Most of the major cities, they're down in New York State, or they're down in New York City. You can find them in Syracuse, you can find them in Ithaca, you can find them in Binghamton. Basically, all of the major cities connected to major highways, mostly through what I suspect to be a lot of 18-wheeler inadvertent transportation of the spotted lanternfly. And what Ag and Markets does sometimes, they have drones that they'll fly over and under 18-wheelers at some checks to look for the egg masses when they can see them, which is always interesting. Here we've got a person doing that under the check right here. And so this blue line is where there are current counties that there are current infestations of the spotted lanternfly, and this is where I have bad news. As of right now, the closest known infestation to right here is in southern Albany County. It is that close. There's another one in Greene County as well. But as of now, those are the two closest things to here. And that's why I had the backpack, because we know that it's coming, basically. But it's not a fruitless endeavor by this point, pun absolutely intended. It'll be a fruitless endeavor if they get here, but I'm pissed. Thanks for laughing at that. But a major thing to do for the spotted lanternfly is, if any of you see one, and I hope you don't, I would consider it a personal favor if you kill it immediately, and then let me know about it. I will go into some of that more here, and I've got a bunch of information about the spotted lanternfly here. And then one of the major things, in my opinion, that can be the most impactful of the spotted lanternfly is connecting with growers, wineries, breweries, places like that where they're going to have a vested interest in trying to prevent the species from getting here. And not only that, if they have an interest in it, their customers will have an interest in it. And really, that's where things have the most impact, is when people can actually connect something to something that they enjoy. And if any of you are feeling studious or have your favorite brewery, your favorite winery, down at that table in the very back, I've got a handful of folders that are back there, and those are our spotted lanternfly outreach folders. And I implore you, if you have a brewery or a winery that you love, take one of those with you. And next time you go there, just drop it off with them. Make sure they know about it, because it's really hard for me and us to try to get to all of these places. So as much help as you can do, really you'll be thanking yourself in 3 years. And also there are some yellow bags back there that say spotted lanternfly on them, and they are free for whoever gets to them first, because I don't want to take them with me. No pressure. If you see the egg masses, if you see them, take a picture of them first and then report it to Ag and Markets, which that information you can find on the 2 brochures I have up here about the spotted lanternfly. But this egg mass destruction also works for the spongy moth. Scraping the eggs off with something hard, a scraper card. I use whichever credit card has the highest APR on it. I just scrape stuff right off with that. Scraping them off is a great start, but scraping them off into either an isopropyl alcohol or like a Dawn dish soap mix to just render the eggs non-viable, so that you're not accidentally just having them hatch later once you've scraped them off anyway. And actually, before I get to this, one more really fast anecdote that is super important. So one of the people in my office, Diane, great person, she was at the farmer's market in Saratoga Springs, and she got a nice head of romaine lettuce that came from a farm in Pennsylvania. She goes home the next day, and there was a live adult spotted lanternfly in that head of lettuce. And while I am very sad that she had to go through that personally, I am very happy that she did, because I know about it now, and that is not a vector of transportation that I necessarily would have thought was a possible thing until someone actually pointed it out to me. And now, quick tangent. So this is a quick identification for the tree of heaven. The tree of heaven is another invasive species. It is here, it is all over the place, and it is the preferred host of the spotted lanternfly. And it's relatively easy to identify. Obviously I say that, I've spent a lot of time looking at plants. So this is the bark of the tree of heaven, and what's always been described to me is that it looks like cantaloupe. And I don't know how that makes sense, but it makes perfect sense to me. Cantaloupe-looking bark, I promise there's not a lot of other stuff that looks like that. And then their leaves are these super-duper pinnately compound leaves right here. A bunch of leaflets, usually upwards of 20. And then the best way to tell, each one of these leaflets has a tiny little gland at the base of the leaf. And if you crush the leaf, it smells like rotten peanut butter. No other plant is going to do that. Rotten peanut butter is the ticket to the Tree of Heaven. Whoever named Tree of Heaven, I'm going to have words with them. I disagree with their assessment. Tree of Heaven. More like Tree of Lupins. And this is also, aside from reaching out to whatever your favorite local companies are, the number one thing that you can do should you want to be a part of trying to prevent the spotted lanternfly is you can sign up for these spotted lanternfly grids. This is the website right here through New York's IMAP Invasives. This is a partnership with the Department of Ag and Markets. Each one of these little squares represent a grid that we ask you just go survey 3 times a year, once in spring, once in summer, once in fall. And they're square mile plots of all publicly accessible land. And we just ask that you go and check for either Tree of Heaven or the spotted lanternfly. And if you have an interest in it, this QR code will take you to that link. So if you take a picture of this, you'll be able to get to that at a later date. And also, you can email me any of this stuff, and I can just facilitate it that way for you as well. All right, now that that depressing thing is done, who wants to get even more depressed? This is beech leaf disease. This is a very new, very novel pathogen of beech trees, which are, as some of you I imagine know, are already sort of going through it with the things that are going after them. Little bit of background on beech leaf disease. Beech leaf disease was originally discovered in Ohio in 2012 in Lake County. It affects, obviously, the leaves of the beech. And now, I'll talk about beech bark disease in a slide because their connection is very important. But fundamentally, so beech bark disease is a tree that affects the native beeches, American beech, Fagus granifolia. Beech leaf disease is a novel pathogen that not only affects native beeches, but it also impacts the ornamental beeches as well, your European beech, your Chinese beech, and things like that. And there are a significant amount of things that we don't know about beech leaf disease. We don't fully understand its methods of spread. We have some idea of causal agents. We know that there is a causal role of this nematode right here, Liddylanchus crenitae mccannii. I call it LCM most of the time because that is a mouthful. This is actually a new species of nematode. This mccannii is the first instance of Liddylanchus crenitae found in the Western Hemisphere. It's a nematode believed to be native to the Pacific Rim, where it has been shown doing interesting gall-like things to Japanese beeches there. But basically, we don't fully understand also the methods of how it kills the trees fundamentally, but we do know that it affects their photosynthetic capacity, it affects the leaves, and ultimately, mature trees will die within typically 7 years of infection, whereas understory trees, which is much more common understory trees, typically die within about 3 years of infection. And that is, I'll talk about the ways that that interplays with beech bark disease right now, as a matter of fact. So beech bark disease is it's a complex of 2 different things. It's a non-native beech scale insect, thought to be native to Greece, that feeds on beech trees with relatively small impact or harm to the tree. But the problem is they feed on the trees, and then their feeding creates these openings for a neonectria fungus to come in, and it's a canker fungus, and that causes these typical cankers of beech bark disease. And approximately 1% of American beech trees are resistant to beech bark disease. And now, where this sort of correlates to beech leaf disease is beech bark disease sort of fundamentally changed the way that beeches function in the ecosystem now. Beeches were historically these large, slow-growing climax species, large mass-producing trees. But what beech bark does, beech bark kills the trees, but then stimulates root sprouts to come up from the root system. So then a bunch more small root sprouts will come up, where they will grow until a certain size, where they are then fed on by the scale, infected by the neonectria, and then this whole process continues again and forms what is referred to as beech thickets, which are just these instances of beech sending up so many sprouts that they basically make the forest impenetrable, and in some ways sometimes act as a functional invasive species because of how much they can shade things out. And typically for beech bark disease, one of the management methods had been to go in and identify trees that were showing a resistance and then removing trees that did not have a resistance in the hopes of bolstering that genetic impact of those resistant trees to try to propagate more resistant offspring. And the unfortunate thing is that beech leaf disease has now rendered that strategy completely moot, because whereas beech bark disease kills the above ground portion but stimulates root sprouting, beech leaf disease just comes in and sweeps the leg and it's over. There is no root sprouting. It is just absolute tree death that cannot really be avoided. And it's interesting the way that the two are correlating, because it's also fundamentally sort of invalidated a lot of work that had been done to produce a beech bark resistant variety of beech tree, because now being resistant to beech bark just doesn't cut it anymore. So now we've had to shift our strategy to try to observe, are there resistances? What are the pathways that beech leaf disease is actually using to infect the tree? What can we learn about it? And that's where we're still attempting to learn a lot about it. There are some management strategies being tested, some in Ohio and some in Maine, for infected trees, but as of now, that is all still very early on. We haven't hit the peer-reviewed stage of that yet. Now, the most important thing to do for beech leaf disease, especially in this area, is monitoring for it. So up until very recently, the Capital Region PRISM region, for lack of a better term, was the only one of the 8 PRISM regions that did not have a positive detection of beech leaf disease in it. But that changed a couple of weeks ago when we got our first positive identification of beech leaf disease at Five Rivers Environmental Education Center down in Del Mar. So really, the most important thing for beech leaf disease now is monitoring its spread so that we can, A, by monitoring its spread, we can hope to understand better mechanisms by which it is spreading, and then B, hope to identify potentially resistant stands that might have resistant genetic material. So I'm going to go through some of the signs of beech leaf disease, and a really useful thing to do. This is one of the easiest things to monitor for. Beech is one of the most common trees in the state, and the way you monitor for this, you just go to whatever your favorite place to go is, if it has trees, and you just walk along, and then you look up, and you look at the canopy above you, and you look for these signs. The first sign that is always going to show up with beech leaf disease is this interveinal darkening. You can see it's pretty conspicuous that the beech leaves have these very, very distinct parallel venations. They're super, super distinct leaves in the forest. Nothing else is going to look like them. And this really distinct dark banding is very, very obvious when you're looking up into the canopy from below with the sunlight coming down from up above. It makes it, now it's obviously not always 100%, because and shadows can look weird when you're walking below them, but you can just pull the leaf down. And not only is that area darker, if you feel it, it's also noticeably thicker than the rest of the segments of the leaf are that don't have those. And it's also important to note that the way that beech leaf disease is interacting with trees right now, you can have an entire healthy canopy with one really unhealthy branch. Or you can have, we've seen fully unhealthy canopies with one healthy branch. So it's something to be vigilant for as you're walking out in the forest. And there's more things. As the disease progresses, the leaves start to curl and become leathery. And it's also important to note these symptoms are evident and abundant right at bud break. They don't appear later throughout the season. Typically, the nematodes seem to infect the buds of the leaves. And then as soon as the leaves come out, they come out in this already altered state. So these are a lot curled, they're significantly leathery feeling, and if you a typical beech leaf is much more, it's very papery in the way that it feels. That leathery feeling is very distinctly different than how it would feel for a healthy tree. And then as that continues to progress, leaves yellow, they undergo necrosis and they die, canopies thin, and it's an important one, the premature leaf drop of leaves. And you can even see in this leaf that has fallen, it's harder to see in the fallen leaf, but right here, there is some of that interveinal darkening and thickening of the leaf, the mesophyll tissue. And there are several things that look that can very easily look like beach leaf disease if you're surveying and you can convince yourself otherwise. So this is beach rolling aphid. It causes this rolling and a little bit of this change in color. But you'll notice that this isn't a thickening as much as it is a thinning of these areas that are impacted. They're being thinned by the aphid, which can then make the non-thin segments seem thick by comparison. But if you pull the leaf down and you see that there's the actual thinning of the material, you'll know that that's not actually beach leaf disease. Did I break it? I broke it. It wasn't my fault, I promise. Hey, there we go. Another thing that looks common is anthracnose. Anthracnose is a super duper common thing that impacts a lot of trees, typically caused by a fungus. And this just is this rolling back, this browning from the outside. And you're not going to have this patchy browning with beach leaf disease. You're going to have fully brown leaves, not patchy like this. And these aren't going to have the thickening that beach leaf disease will have. Iridium patch, this is just caused by mites that feed on it. They feed on this area. It generally becomes yellow early in the season and then gradually darkens to orange and brown as the season continues on. But again, this is a thinning of the leaves and not a thickening of the leaves. So once you pull the leaves down and look at them, it becomes very obvious. And this next one is not really a disease, but it's important to know. So beech leaf, if you've ever been out in the woods in the wintertime, you've noticed that there are certain trees that tend to hold their leaves on throughout the whole winter. Those are almost always beech trees. Oaks do it a little bit too, but beeches are really known for their marcescence. That's the name of that trait. And that's just the retention of their dead leaves throughout the winter. It's thought to maybe be a defense against herbivory from deer by making the twig and the bud less palatable while being covered in dead material. But keep this marcescence in mind, and we'll go back and power me a few slides ago when I mentioned that premature leaf drop-off. And with this context, you can know now how aberrational that premature leaf drop-off is with beech trees. They typically hold their leaves longer than anything else. So if it's August and you've got brown leaves on the ground, no bueno. This is a map showing the spread of the beech leaf disease. Over here, this is its initial introduction in Lake County. And interesting anecdotal note, all of its initial introductions are surrounding Lake Erie, which potential vector, maybe, I don't know. But it has since spread throughout here. That's up in Hamilton County, and now we have got one over here in Albany County as well. So this one is super important to monitor for, and finding infestations in counties that we don't know they're there is super duper impactful. This is just a nice little picture of all the BLD surveys that were done in the state last year. You can see that, oh man, look at all this nice blue in here. Well, no longer. We are tainted with the presence of beech leaf disease. If you find it, how do you report it? Easy enough. IMAP Invasives is the state's invasive species monitoring network. It's free to download this app. And if you have any interest in it, I would implore you to email me. I can send you a bunch of things about how to sign up for it. I even do periodic trainings on how to use the app, and then I'll take people out in the field and we'll walk around and we'll identify some things and we'll practice putting in the observations together. But this is a very useful tool for reporting, and if you were to report it, you're not going to find it under beech leaf disease. It will be under the name of the nematode Lydilanchus crenate mccannii. Don't try to say that, you might hurt yourself. And if you don't have IMAP, that's just fine too. Take pictures if you see it, record the location of where you saw it, and then send those pictures to foresthealth@dec.newyork.gov. You can also send them to me if you'd like to, and then I will just send them to the DEC. But they are very much going to want to know about this. And in some ways, it's a little bit suspicious that the first beech leaf disease was right next to the Forest Health Diagnostics Lab. I don't know. I'm just kidding. They're good people. All right, another one that is not yet present in this area, too bad yet, but is currently wreaking havoc downstate, if you are aware of it all. This is the southern pine beetle. This one is interesting This is our first species that is actually native to the continental United States. This is, you can guess by its name, it is more southern in its origin, originally found mostly in the Florida area, the southeast. Over here, you can see all of this reddening of these pines. That is the path of destruction of the southern pine beetle. They're a very small beetle. I'll show you some slides in the next one, but suffice it to say, they haven't just stayed down south, if you can believe it. So, very small red and black beetle. This is a bunch of grains and rice, and this is our culprit right there, Mr. Southern Pine Beetle. Very, very interesting way that they interact with trees. Typically, the adults will go in, they'll eat a little bit, they'll do what they do, they'll leave all their babies around, their eggs will hatch, and they will go all throughout the inner cambium of the tree and leave these really complicated S-shaped galleries, which are, if you can imagine, these are really bad for the movement of nutrients throughout the tree. The cambium is essentially the vascular tissue, the vein system of the tree. And I don't know about you, but I do not want these in my veins, all of those cross cuts. No, thank you, I'll pass on that. And then over here, I'll get into this a little bit more in later slides, but this is what it looks like as the trees try to force the beetles out, and those are pitch tubes that the trees use to try to push them out, but spoiler alert, it doesn't actually work that well. So, the southern pine beetle impacts all species of hard pine. And now your pines typically fall into two categories, your hard pines and your soft pines. For the sake of argument, when I say hard pines, I mean basically every pine that's not a white pine. White pine is your obvious soft pine. And in New York, they go almost exclusively, not totally exclusively, but by far, pitch pine is the pine that is by far disproportionately affected by the southern pine beetle. And this picture is both great and terrifying, that shows the general way that they'll feed. So this all started with one tree at the center of this. The beetles go in and they release an attack pheromone, letting other beetles know they're attacking this tree. More beetles come in and they all start feeding and reproducing in the tree. And now most trees can typically push out a couple of beetles. That's what these pitch tubes are. The beetles will go in and the trees will release the pitch to push them out. But eventually, so many beetles go in that the tree can't overcome that much. And then you start with one initial tree in the center. Beetles go in and they reproduce, and then an exponentially higher amount of beetles exit the tree than enter the tree. And then they exit that first tree, and then they go into the next ring of trees around them. And then the whole process starts all over again, but with more trees, and then with more trees, and with more trees. And you can see that the widening sort of attack front as they have just expanded their radius of destruction, dominance. They're doing it, and then down there too. It's pretty destructive. And some of this is stuff that I mentioned. The adult beetles go in, they feed, they disrupt the flow of nutrients. There you can see one of those little beetles getting pushed out by that pitch tube. And it's interesting that really the southern pine beetle is a correction of, I don't want to say mismanaged, but in the southern pine beetles, like how it evolved in a pine barrens ecosystem. And typically a pine barrens ecosystem will have one tree about every 80 feet, give or take, broadly speaking. And when you've got trees that are that far spread out, these beetles don't have nearly as much reproductive capacity as they do in a place where there are super crazy overstocked pines, which is what is happening in the Long Island pine barrens right now. The pines were really, really overstocked. There were way more pines than there should have been. And the southern pine beetle, as winters warmed, the pine beetle moved up the coast and then got into the pine barrens where it has it's like coming out swinging like you would not believe. It has done tremendous damage in the pine barrens. It is still a very active fight that the DEC is trying to do right now. And a lot of what they do is try to proactively thin in areas as they're expanding to try to reduce the reproductive capacity of the beetles to get to the more trees. And then in addition to that, they are adapted to ecosystems that are fire adapted as well. And then the fire not only kills the beetles and keeps the tree's populations down, but also the smoke that the fire produces disrupts the beetle's ability to detect that attack pheromone that they release when they go after a tree, which is another thing that helps prevent them from going totally crazy. But they get to areas that haven't been managed for having a prototypical pine barrens ecosystem, so this has become a really, really big problem. And as it's continued to move up the state, good news, bad news, there are traps for this all over the place. The farthest north that they have found these in traps is in the Saratoga Sand Plains. They have found them up that far north, but they haven't found them in trees. They've just found them in traps in only very few numbers, but they have found individuals infested in trees at a park little a ways southeast of here called Taconic Lake State Park or Taconic State Park, one of the two. But that is the farthest north that they have actually removed infested trees. So they're on the way, and especially if you're up in the Saratoga Sand Plains area, that is an area that I worry about a lot. But there's a lot of pines up there, and also it's a very valuable habitat for things like the Corner blue butterfly, which is an endangered species of butterfly in here. And actually, fun fact, the pine barrens, the Albany pine barrens, the pine bush rather, is in my opinion, one of the best managed pine barrens that I've ever been to. So I wouldn't worry too much about that spot, at the very least. This is a lot of things that I have already said because it's all in my brain apparently. But this does a good job of showing not only their depth, but how much they can change a forest structure as well. Because all of these, not only are these trees dead, but they're standing dead in a way that impacts the light availability getting down to this area. So it's interesting what the implications of it are going to be long term. It's interesting to find out what's going to be able to be done about it really in the future, but I know that they are making active management decisions down in the pine barrens, trying to figure things out, doing preventative cuts, trying to save the pitch pines as much as we can. We're trying. It's not easy, but we're trying. And then here you can see there's a couple of different things to look for if you're ever out looking for pines and you want to know if the pine beetle is there. Down here you can see what are called the shotgun holes that they make as they leave the bark. This is from all their babies crawling out. This is their galleries. Then, important distinction. There are native pine beetles to this area that will go into trees, but they're not nearly as destructive as the southern pine beetle. And the way you can tell that difference is the native to this region beetles, that's an error, I'm supposed to say 6 feet, not 60 feet. The native beetles will only have pitch tubes that go up to about 6 feet up the bowl of the tree. Whereas southern pine beetle, you will have pitch tubes going up the entire length of the tree trunk, all the way from the bottom to the top. And also, it's a worry because there's a lot of areas where I worry that pine is overstocked in some areas, which overstocking a tree in places that it shouldn't be not only can weaken the tree genetically, but also it can open more corridors for things to move through by connecting habitats that weren't originally connected to one another. And I think this is going to be the last one I'm going to do. I'm going to try to do this relatively quickly because this one is super duper crazy important to me as well. This is oak wilt. This is a fungus that is highly, highly, highly destructive to oak trees. It is one of the most virulent and effective pathogens of trees that I've ever seen in my entire life. This is what the actual fungal mat looks like. But the real kicker of oak wilt, so it's a fungus. I studied botany, not fungus, so I'm not even going to try to say that. And it affects oaks. It affects them both slightly differently. And a little quick background, oaks can be split up into two broad subcategories, your white oaks and your red oaks. The easy way to tell is that if the oak leaves have points at the end of the lobes, it's a red oak. If they're rounded, it's a white oak. And those two types of oak families, they interact slightly differently, but broadly speaking, red oaks are killed significantly faster than white oaks are. They have much more porous wood material, which is why typically you don't have whiskey aged in a red oak barrel, because it's too porous of a material. And then worse than that, red oaks, they graft their roots together in forest stands. And the disease, when it gets into the tree, it clogs up their entire vascular tissue, and it can kill an entire stand of red oak in less than 2 months. From fully healthy to fully dead. It impacts one tree, and then the disease can spread between the root grafts to every tree in the stand. And it just massacres them. It is absolutely brutal. Slightly optimistically, the white oak subgroup, the wood is not nearly as porous, and they don't graft their roots together naturally. So it typically takes up to about 2 years for oak wilt to sweep the legs and finish off the white oak. And they don't graft their roots to one another, so it doesn't spread quite as quickly. But just, it's insane for my brain to try to comprehend an entire stand of healthy red oaks dying in a month. That is wild and terrifying. And oaks are one of the most valuable tree species to wildlife. Just broadly speaking, most of the native oaks here house at least 600 different species of native arthropods that live on them, which then feed the bird species, which then feed, you guys know how trophic systems work. I don't need to get into that too much right now. But how do you tell oak wilt from just some other random instance or some other random pathogen? The first thing to note, the leaves will brown in a very, very distinct way. And you can sort of see it in this picture here. The leaves will brown from the outside of the leaf and then move in towards the center. Very, very distinct browning pattern. Like, this is so aberrational for how a leaf typically will brown to be still green in the center. So that is an incredibly distinct thing to note. And also, if you're seeing significant amounts of brown oak leaves in non-fall months, that is a very big red flag, especially if it's branches that are all browned together. Typically, oak wilt is similar to beech leaf disease in that you can have a branch that is really symptomatic, and then bang, bang, boom, all the trees are dead, which is an absolute bummer. And then this is the fungal mat, which has a weird fruity smell. You don't have to smell it, I've done it for you. But the beetles love it. And I'm not talking about John, Paul, or George, I'm talking about these guys. So there's two main ways that this spreads. I've talked about the root grafting a little bit right there. But then the other way is these beetles, not these ones specifically, these are just an artistic representation of some beetles. But the beetles they'll detect wounds on a tree. They go in, they feed on the tree, they pick up the spores of the fungus, then they go to the next tree, and they bring that with them, which is why a lot of these things I have over here, it's very important. If you have oaks on your property, do not prune them in the spring and the summertime. Do not do it. And if you have to do it, cover up the wound with something. Because even just something as simple as, I want to trim this branch back a little bit, that is an open wound that the beetles will detect. They will come in, and they might not have fungal spores on them, but they might have fungal spores on them. And nobody wants that. I don't want my trees to die. I love my trees very much. So there's that thing that I just said. And now this is important. Over here, this is the oak wilt distribution, and oh my gosh, what is that right there? Glenville, right around here, is actually was the first instance of oak wilt found in the state. This was a couple of years ago, and has been relatively eradicated there, but it is a big process. We go in, remove whole trees, try to remove other trees in the nearby area to prevent possible spread. Oak wilt is absolutely no joke, and this really goes for a lot of things, but don't move firewood with you wherever you're going. Always use local kiln-treated firewood, because you don't know who's going to be hitching a ride in there. It could be the ash borer, it could be the Asian longhorn beetle. You could have one beetle that's got this on. You could have the fungus in there. You never know what you could be bringing from one spot to another, so just try to always be vigilant of that, and protect your oaks. Look at that, there's one of those right there. How about them apples? Then we got this big thing that we drive around sometimes. If you think you have oak wilt, I hope none of you do. If you think you have oak wilt, call the DEC and let them know. It is very important they know. Or call me and let me know. I'll tell them for you. This is just an example of some of this is just a quick, jaunty picture of a house that had to have trees removed. This line represents all the oak trees that they had to remove because only some were infected. Because you just risk it. And it is super serious. All right, it is 8:10 right now. Do you guys want to hear about hemlock woolly adelgid, or do you want to go home?
Yes. Come on. We have to go, but don't be offended.
All right, I'll run through this one. Hemlock woolly adelgid, Adelgis sugae. Most of you probably know about this one a little bit. Interestingly, this is our second character that is technically native to the continent. The hemlock woolly adelgid that infects our eastern hemlocks is native to both Japan and the Pacific Northwest. Very interesting. It's actually been in the Pacific Northwest for maybe 10,000 years. Our western hemlocks are super well adapted to them. But anyway, it's interesting. So every species of hemlock in the world, they all sort of exist in the same broad equatorial range. Each one has an obligate species of adelgid, except for the eastern hemlock. I don't know why it didn't evolve with an obligate species of adelgid, but it didn't. And such is life. And now hemlock is what we call a foundational species, meaning that hemlock itself being there creates the environmental factors that sort of define that ecosystem. Eastern hemlock is an incredibly long-living, incredibly slow-growing, incredibly shade-tolerant tree species. And if you've ever been in a hemlock stand, you'll know that there is no other, at least in this area, there's no other tree that creates a hemlock stand, or that creates a feeling like a hemlock stand does. You can walk from a beech birch maple stand into a dense hemlock stand, and you will feel the temperature drop probably 15 degrees as soon as you get in there. The level of shade that they provide is absolutely bonkers. They provide this great habitat for some of my favorite wildflowers grow near hemlocks. Monotropa uniflora, which is an awesome parasitic plant, grows really well under hemlocks. And they provide a bunch of different ecosystem services as well. Obviously, they provide shelter for birds and things, but they also they play a very large role in keeping streams cool, which is very important for brook trout and the native trout to New York State. Very, very important for that. Without hemlocks, most of the waters would be too warm for trout to survive. In addition to that, their heavy, dense shading keeps snow melt from melting until longer, which keeps water temperatures cooler longer by not overloading the system with that cold water runoff until later in the system. And actually, probably the most important thing about hemlock from a human perspective is its tremendous ability to filter water and groundwater. A lot of reservoirs in New York State for drinking water are surrounded by hemlocks. For example, Albany's water supply is surrounded by a hemlock grove that filters the water going into the water supply. New York City's water supply is surrounded by hemlock groves. Syracuse's water supply is surrounded by hemlock groves, which provides super incredible value to keeping that water clean and clear and usable for all of us. And there's all of those things that I just said, but way less interesting than how I said them. This is a great picture. This is Pisgah National Forest from North Carolina, and these are all dead hemlock trees. And like I said before, super slow growing, super long living. These are trees that cannot and will not be replaced by anything that we can put in there. The loss of hemlock could pose very large fundamental changes for how New York ecosystems work. It is one of the most common trees in the state right now. Unfortunately, I say right now, because you never know how these things are going to shake out. And it's tragic too, because we don't fully understand at this point the actual mechanism of why the adelgid kills the trees as effectively as it does. And it's also interesting and a bummer. So the adelgid, obviously it's a non-native insect pest, but in its native range, it actually has two hosts. It feeds on the eastern hemlock and then it reproduces on spruce trees. But for whatever reason, the population of hemlock woolly adelgid on the East Coast is all female and it all reproduces asexually, which means that it takes one individual to start an infestation, which is a bummer. Just to put it bluntly, it really sucks. One individual can balloon into an entire infestation, and this is just the spread of the species throughout, this is basically the whole range of, yeah, well, you can see what those things are, but it's bad, and as the winters are warming, it's encroaching more and more into the Adirondacks, where we thought that the colder temperatures and the colder, harsher winters might keep it from getting into there, which is where so many of our old growth hemlock stands are. But we're on the cusp. It's not a couple months ago, I was surveying at what is right now the northernmost point of hemlock woolly adelgid, and we were about halfway up Lake George, right near 5 Mile Point, and that, as of now, is the farthest north that the hemlock woolly adelgid has gotten. So what does it look like? This is what the little babies look like. They're real cute, and depending on if you're into that or not. And interestingly, they only move at the very beginning stage of their life. This is their crawler stage, and what they do in this crawler stage is they'll nudge up along. This is a hemlock branch right here, and they will go right up against the needle at the base of the needle on the twig. And that's one of them right there, and they will create this little white halo around them. This is their sesame seed stage. If you were going to look for them right now, this is what you would see, and these are basically invisible to the naked eye. You need a hand lens to see them. And then over winter, they will feed and they will continue to develop this white woolly mass, and that is the very prototypical identification feature of the hemlock woolly adelgid, is these white woolly masses. There are some things that look like them. Spider eggs can look like them. Sap can look like them, but you're always going to find them right on the twig, never on the needle, always on the twig. And genuinely, it is such a pure white wool. It's one of those things where I've always been told my whole life, if you can't tell if you're looking at a raven or a crow, it's a crow. If it's a raven, you will know that it's a raven. And it's sort of like that with hemlock woolly adelgid. I spent a straight up 3-month period of my life doing nothing but surveying for hemlock woolly adelgid, and it was very easy for me to talk myself into and out of it until I actually saw one in person myself, and was like, oh, these are very distinct, almost like a shiny blue-white, as compared to a lot of the spider sacks are more of a yellowish white than that blue-white is. And this is just another great picture. This is a great picture of showing a really heavily infested branch right there. This is a good picture of those little guys at their halo stage. And this picture does a good job of showing the sort of the zoomed out, broad scale tree impact. You can see not only is there dieback, but that sort of gray cast to the foliage is really emblematic of the hemlock woolly adelgid. That's a real bummer. I'm sorry, I got nothing but bad news most of the time. I apologize for that. I try to at least deliver it with some excitement, but you know how things go. All right, I can rapidly go through the emerald ash borer. How do you feel? Yay or nay?
Yeah.
All right, your cacophony of silence tells me to go forward. So this one is much unlike some of the other ones I've talked about. This one is basically here, and it's just a matter of us growing accustomed to its presence at this point. I'm not stopping you if you've heard this one before. This is an insect native to Asia that came over here via shipping materials. Oh, that's never happened before. So it's a very charismatic looking insect. I actually just saw my first live emerald ash borer a couple days ago. They're very rare to see in the wild. I see evidence of them all the time, but the beetles themselves are really, really tiny, like can fit on the head of a dime. It's not nearly as exciting as this picture would have you believe. But these are absolutely notorious for what they've done to ash trees. As it says right there, ash trees make up about 8% of all trees in New York. That's probably much lower than it is right now. One of the really cynical ways I used to teach people to identify ash trees was if it was dead, that's an ash tree. That was my cynical way of doing it. It's also cynical in that oftentimes, anytime someone's ever called me to be like, hey, can you come stop by and look at this, tell me if I've got an emerald ash borer? Almost always, just the fact that you're asking tells me that you probably are going to have it, which is usually the case. Super insanely destructive forest pest. I love this little picture of him sticking his face out. And that's actually how we captured the live one. We were out collecting genetic information. We've been working with a college to go out and collect genetic information from living ash stands so they can try to just get genetic information from them. And we were scraping one off, and we saw one as it was emerging. And then we just put a plastic bag over it and sealed it when he came out. And now he's in my office just hanging out with all the other dead invasive insects that are on my desk right now. That's fine. I'm the weird guy at the office. So the signs to look for with the emerald ash borer. This D-shaped exit hole is the big one, 100%. If you've got the D-shaped exit hole, you've got emerald ash borer, almost guaranteed. This is the D-shaped hole in action as the little beetle popping his way out of there. And then you'll also notice, it's hard to tell in this picture, I'll probably have a better picture of it in a moment, but this lighter color of the bark, that is very emblematic of the emerald ash borer infestation, because the woodpeckers can tell that the ash borer is in there and they go crazy for it. All this lighter stuff on the ash bark, that's called blonding, or that's what we call blonding. And that's just from the woodpeckers tearing away at the wood to expose what's underneath. Very obvious. Like, usually by the time you get to this point, you've already started to experience that crown dieback. And sometimes you'll see what I have on this next slide. Another very obvious sign. Really, this is a sign of trauma on any tree. This is called epicormic shooting. And this is when you have branches coming out from the bole of the tree. And basically what this is, it's when the tree can tell that its crown is dead and that there's not nutrients getting up there. So what it does is it activates dormant buds along the bole of the tree. And it basically just sends out desperation branches, a bunch of Hail Marys that they're not going to solve the problem, they're just prolonging an unfortunate end. And then, once you peel the bark back, very similar to the galleries of the southern pine beetle are these really distinct S-shaped galleries of the emerald ash borer, which is super distinct. It's somewhat pretty. I was doing a management plan when I was in college for a property in Pennsylvania, and we went down to do a site visit, and they had a bunch of ash trees that had been killed by emerald ash borers. What they did was they peeled the bark off of all of them, and then they brought in a bunch of art students, and the art students painted and did a bunch of really cool stuff with the old leftover trees, which is really cool. That's a cool thing to do. Obviously, they took off the branches and they topped the trees so that they're not a hazard anymore, but it was really pretty. And the main thing with the emerald ash borer is that ash trees fall, and they fall hard, and they fall heavy. And this is that has been the biggest consequence of the emerald ash borer, really, is that oftentimes it's trees in public areas, public places where you can't afford not to take a tree down. And basically, when you're trying to think about how risky a tree is, it's only a risk if there's something for it to fall on. And oftentimes, ash trees were planted very heavily in places where they were replacing elms, chestnuts, other trees that were gone. So they became very popular in street trees, and then once you know it, sort of back to what I was mentioning to you earlier, when these things become very popular as urban trees, what that can do is, in some instances, if a new insect or pathogen is introduced, those street trees can connect two different ecosystems that wouldn't other have a connective corridor between them. But the urban trees provide a stopgap in between one population to the next. If you think you have EAB, my personal recommendation is to visit the DEC website. They've got a nice thing about recommendations for what to do for homeowners. That QR code will also take you to that website should you choose to go there, and I can also happily send it to you at a later time. I'm skipping elm zigzag sawfly. That's all I have for you. Thank you very much. I'll also answer questions if anybody has any. I know you preempted. I knew you'd have one.
I have a maple tree, a big tall maple tree, that the edges of the leaves are turning black and they're curling up. How do you know who to call to come look at it and see if it can be treated, or does it have to be cut down, or?
You can always, at the very least, I would recommend you can reach out to me. If you got some stuff with you, I'll definitely look at it. See what we got. Let's do some real. I hope I don't make a fool out of myself.
You can keep that, I have more.
Thank you. Is it pretty ubiquitous throughout the whole whole crown?
Yes, pretty much the whole tree. It's about a 40-foot tall tree.
Interesting. Looks like a silver maple. I don't know specifically what this could be, but if you'd like, I can take this with me and I can show it to some other people who might have an idea, and I'd love to get back to you about that.
Okay.
And I'm even going to give you one of my cards to make sure that you and I can have some contact.
Okay.
At the very least, I can tell you what it looks like. I'll do some investigative research on this.
I'll send you an email so you'll have my address.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
And never feel bad if you have to give me a second nudge email because I haven't responded in too long. Don't feel bad about that. I'm very forgetful sometimes. It happens to me all the time. So please reach out to me. I will let you know about that. I will look into that.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Anybody else have any questions? Yes, my friend.
This whole area, especially to the rear of the library, along a walking path, there are some very large white oaks. Is there anything being done to protect those, or should they be protected? Should they be watched?
It depends on like if they're watching them for like specifically spongy moth. You can do some preventative, like banding is a good thing to do if you're trying to watch out for the spongy moth. At least as far as oak wilt goes, I wouldn't worry too much about those as long as you're not doing anything actively bad to encourage an introduction. So as long as you're not pruning the oaks, I wouldn't worry about them as far as specifically oak wilt. But for the spongy moth, it's sort of a nuanced thing. So you've got to watch it for, are there egg masses showing up on it? Are we seeing defoliation? And obviously with the earlier you can get to these things, the better. But by now, if it's probably not being super hardly defoliated, I wouldn't be incredibly worried about it. I would still keep a vigilant eye on it. But a lot of times with the spongy moth, people will do like the banding, as I said, which is even easier on smaller trees like that. And in some really extreme circumstances, some people have chemically treated their trees to prevent the spongy moth. However, the very, very serious implication with that is that there is no insecticide that will only kill the spongy moth. You will be killing every arthropod that comes into contact with the oak trees, which is very bad considering how many species of arthropods live on oak trees. It's over 600. It's the nuance of life. Nothing's ever easy or simple. But hey, that's what keeps me employed. I'll take it. Does that answer your question, or did I just make it worse?
No, that's
All right, fantastic. Anybody else have any other questions? All right, I feel like a cacophony of silence. Thank you all so much for coming in. I very much appreciate it. Oh, I got a hand? Did you put a hand up?
I started to, but I don't know how much it's got to do with the bugs, but I've got like a mix of trees in my backyard.
Can you go around? Excuse me? Can you go around?
Yes.
Thank you.
I didn't think, sorry.
It depends. Is it, now out of curiosity, is this a new thing you're noticing? Or is it one of those things where you're like, I'm noticing it now, but I don't know, I was never looking for it before. Is this new?
I don't remember seeing it now.
Because it's definitely something to monitor. There are a lot of things. Did you say it was a white pine?
I don't
Or
know
just a
what
pine?
kind. They're so tall and it's such a mix of trees. The other trees block and they're really tall. If they fell,
It's definitely, like, there are definitely some things that will go after, I don't know why in my head I'm thinking it was a white pine. But there's a various different things that attack white pine and cause just what's vaguely known as white pine decline. But it could be that, it could be just drought stress. I know that in some areas, for example, I was at Thatcher Park a couple of months ago, they have a bunch of really big red pines up near where the climbing area is. And a lot of those pines were really severely red. And that was really just from drought stress and environmental factors. So it could just be that it is drought stress affecting the trees that has been an absolutely brutal stretch for rain over the past 30, 31 days. So that could be one thing, but I would also say I don't want to accidentally steer you down the wrong path. if you want to, you're more than welcome to take some pictures and email them to me, and I can try to give you a better idea with
Well,
some
thank
actual.
you. But so I had heard on the radio that trees help each other.
Mhm.
So I think if I kill one tree that's questionable, it might be hurting the other trees. I managed to do this already. I took down a tree that was very healthy, but a big branch fell. I thought it was dangerous. And the tree guy said, yeah, you should take it down. And then the tree cut his left. I said, is that the tree? He said, yes. The tree behind him, I can tell, is not good.
I will also say,
Yeah.
always be wary of advice from somebody who stands to gain financially from
Well,
from
what
one
can I
avenue or the other.
Who do you
I
ask?
want to cut it out.
It's some arborists are really good about like being like genuine and honest about
Yes.
like this one we don't need to take down. We're just gonna cut this branch off. And some of them, not everybody's a good person, but not everybody's a bad person. So I would recommend if you wanted to reach out to me, I've got a bunch of cards over there. You're more than welcome to. I can maybe even connect you with some arborists that I trust that I know.
That'd be good.
At the very least, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you.
I can at least help push you into a direction.
That would help. All right, thank you.
Fantastic. Anybody else?